Some people will use a symbolism of the relationship of God to the universe.
That's life. That's what all the people say. Riding high in April, shot down in May. I won't ever let it change my tune. When I'm back on top in June. I said that's life. Funny as it may seem, some people get their kicks stomping on a dream. I will never let it get me down, 'cause this fine old world, it keeps spinning around. Been a puppet, a pauper, a pirate, a poet, a pawn and a king. I've been up and down and over and out, and I know one thing. Each time I find myself flat on my face, I'll pick myself up and get back in the race. That's life. I can't deny it. I thought of quitting, baby, but my heart won't buy it. If I didn't think it was worth one single try, I'd get right on that big bird and I'd fly. Been a puppet, a pauper, a pirate, a poet, a pawn and a king. I've been up and down and over and out, and I know one thing. Each time I find myself flat on my face, I'll pick myself up and get back in the race. That's life. I can't deny it. I thought of quitting, baby, but my heart, it won't buy it. If I don't see nothing shaking come this here July, I'm gonna roll myself out in a big old bar, and
All right. Howdy. Haven't done one of these in a while since Argentina. So I am doing this because I've had. First of all, I finished the Dawn of Everything book that really influenced the podcast Q the Coup, which another episode will be coming out very shortly. But I just wanted to. I'm gonna review the whole book. I'm gonna pull a. I'm just essentially gonna copy Matt Chrisman and do a review of the Dawn of Everything on stream because the book is so immensely inspiring, immensely inspiring, immensely paradigm shifting, but to be totally honest, like you have to take your own interpretations and your own conclusions out of the book, which I think might be the point of it, to be honest. There's sorry, I'm gonna get the chat up for all the chatters. So there's a part of the book that at the very beginning of the book, it essentially is saying, like, hold on to your hats, wait till we get to the end, your mind's gonna be blown. And I really have to say that I think that the way of looking at it from that perspective is not the way that the book should be taken. The book is a book that should be used to demystify long established cliches about early human civilization. It should be about inspiring new ideas, consensus ideas, rather than providing any type of definitive answer. And I think that what the book gestures towards but doesn't really fully get at is the driving factor of our propensity to create social inequality. And I think it kind of gets at the point that the root cause of much human suffering and societal decay is traced back to our inherent drive towards self-alienation and self-destruction, which is this inverse call to the void that is reaching out to the social trust and social bonds that we once had, that was shared with a collective belief in a higher, or just a divine, like such a deep community connection that was almost religious, which both of those things we no longer have. We no longer have an institutionalized belief in a higher, at least in the West. I mean, Islam is still a thing. And we definitely have completely oriented ourselves towards material means rather than any type of understanding of what community is. And this is the important thing about this, is that this alienation, because it affects two sides of the spectrum, right? If social constraints create a situation where a ruler is put into a position where they have to use their power, that alienates them as a ruler, right? And so this is a paradoxical situation where this disconnect from our fundamental connection to a greater understanding of humanity is actually what drives our evolutionary change, because we're able to really shape our individual humanity in a whole bunch of different ways that then creates this evolutionary push. But this also has shaped our psyche and behavior and social structures, which are basically an extension of our psyche in a way that has created this self-replicating system of our mind and how our mind works on these different types of drives. And the higher drives are more towards feelings of love and connection and security, and then the lower ones are based on, food, water, sex, things like that. And I think to really understand all of this and all of where these drives come from, it's really important to understand the origins of not just our civilization, but like just our like the idea of like a group of humans as far back as a state, a higher state of consciousness, a collective consciousness could exist, because there is a unique development of our collective and our individual psyche happening in unison that creates this wild, polar opposite that is still reflected in our psyche when those drives get crossed or get have some type of confliction. And the point of this is basically, so if you look at back just generally historically, societies have long focused on communal living. There's been a shift towards individualism in the past, 500 or so years. But for the most part, we've lived as social beings connected to each other significantly. And this shift towards the individual has created massive contemporary challenges and a future that basically does not exist. And the means in which actually I have some notes here. So all right, so here we go. So throughout most of human history, society has been primarily embraced by a collective ideology. We have primarily embraced a collective ideology, emphasizing communal living and survival. Aristocratic, kingdoms and chiefdoms, the aristocracy, all of that has existed at times, but the prevailing trend in most recent in history has been communal living. We have had times where there have been an aristocracy more recently, but if we look at the larger picture, the last 500 years does not equate to the thousands before that were very much driven towards a collective, even under some type of shared bondage. And this shift towards individualism and personal experiences marks a significant departure from our past. And I think that understanding this evolution is crucial to addressing these challenges and, again, this future that really doesn't exist. And throughout history, this separation from the collective has been exemplified in various ways. A prime example of this hypothetical is the early human who controlled the fire. Bill Cooper always used this example as a Masonic belief, and it is because this is how hierarchy was developed, and it's understanding that possessing fire would grant individuals power. The earliest humans, if you were holding the fire and you kept the fire to yourself, you had the power because you were able to control who also had the fire. And this individualistic approach, while separating those very few people who knew where to get fire from or how to wield the fire, separated them from the collective. And this demonstrates this inherent human trait for seeking individual survival and taking individual advantages through individual means. And now this is not a universal trait. We all have the capacity for it, but some people have the capacity for it. Some beings have the capacity for it more than others. And this classic Masonic example illustrates how these certain skills like controlling fire, hunting, these traits that were based off of either hidden knowledge or violence became the basis of the emergence of ruling classes or chiefs in ancient times. And those who mastered these skills and chose who got to know them and who didn't were the ones who gained the most power. And this, again, was particularly occurring in masculine-dominated society. Skills like fishing, hunting, the use of fire were associated with violence and force. And so this knowledge and decision to divide and withhold created a separation from the collective. And possessing these skills also meant an understanding of brutality and violence and force, which further differentiated individuals from the group. And when questions arose about how this knowledge about the fire, how to wield the fire, was asked, the lack of like a tangible explanation besides just, well, because it's mine or whatever, is this often led to perceptions of divinity. Rather, if like a priestly class of people said, well, that's because you're God, or because you talk to God, the fire represents God, or because the person themselves who had the fire said, I'm God, this represents God. And that's the thing, is like individuals in these groups would believe or lead others to believe that their skills were God-given, or that they had a special connection to the divine power, and that's how they got those skills. And this belief in a divine connection was to justify the accumulation of this information and the use of this force and as a protection, means of protecting this knowledge and these resources that came from it. And so then these were the three primary methods emerge for establishing a hierarchy: the hoarding of vital information, the use of violence and force, and the claim to divinity, the right of kings. And these methods were facilitated the rise of state hierarchies and the division between ruling classes and oppressed classes. The ruling class could justify their position by claiming divine right or by using force to protect their knowledge and resources, which would include these various skills like farming or hunting. And the expansion of what appears to be equality often results in some form of exploitation, as the system itself is built on class divide, and that through the expression of what is our actual psyche collectively. And this historical development of social hierarchies illustrates how human evolution and how our psychological evolution and the pursuit of this individualized self has shaped our societal structures and class systems over time. And again, this Masonic example of this so-called hypothetical early man, we can begin to understand how the concept of royalty and chiefs and the aristocracy throughout history began to be understood. And it was traced back to individuals who perceived themselves as distinct entities, often with a sense of divinity or a higher purpose that was beyond mere biological humanity or collective existence with the community. And this belief was underpinned by this divine right of kings. And societies progressed. As societies progressed, the value placed on these rulers and the spiritual essence to them extended beyond their physical bodies. And this is very important. Civilizations like ancient Egypt held deep reverence for their leaders' bodies, leading to practices such as mummification, symbolizing their separation. Their bodies symbolize their separation from the collective spiritual world as a one that stood out. And this idea of a divinely ordained ruling class became entrenched in society and formed these hierarchies and class systems, which were determined basically by birth. And as populations grew, class division deepened, and there came to a point where if equality was not addressed, the collective power of the people would be able to overthrow the right of the kings, because history has shown that when the collective becomes aware of its power, it can eclipse the authority of the individual. But every time this happens, the individual then buys off the secondary class to be able to make them more individualized, to empower them, to make them greater oppressors. And this dynamic has played out repeatedly throughout history. Rulers and upper classes have often attempted to co-opt and promote this individualism within the collective to maintain control by prevailing class divide. And in ancient Egypt, this basically happened with the royal class viewing their lives as divine and meticulously preparing for the afterlife, believing in a transition rather than death. And they needed safe passage into the spiritual world to do this, and it was facilitated by various items, jewels, luxury goods, but especially fermented items like sacred bread, beverages like different types of proto-beer and wine. And initially, this was exclusive to the elite. These practices, though, eventually spread to the secondary class, which altered the perception of life and death, which led to a shift in this collective consciousness, but only for a certain few, right? Only for this collective became a collective, but somewhat excluded. And this practice of honoring ancestors and ensuring their safe passage with these fermented offerings from the beer, barley, and wine, this marked this emergence of individualism among the secondary classes. And these individuals saw their lives as having meaning and envisioned themselves as well, just like the kings, as to having a distinct afterlife. And this shift, because of the need for these resources, it coincided with the rise of pretty much the very first peasant class, which was driven by the growing of this demand for wheat and barley, which was needed for afterlife rituals. And this is what happened through that, is like this effort, this collective effort to get this wheat and barley fostered mutual trust and support within communities as individuals recognized the collective responsibility of ensuring safe passage for the deceased. And this practice nurtured a sense of shared trust and belief in something greater than the individual, with communities uniting in the common goal to give safe passage to the dead. And through this cycle of individualism, followed by a return to the collective, this has occurred throughout history. The ruling class will promote individualism to prevent that collective uprising, that collective understanding, that collective class consciousness. But people eventually realize that the true fulfillment of individualism is attained with others through a collective framework which fosters social cohesion and mutual trust. And as a result, we see the rise of egalitarian social structures and spiritual collectivism rooted in this institutionalized need to provide safe passage to the deceased. And this illustrates how a practice initially centered on individual afterlife beliefs for kings evolved in the cornerstone of collective societal organization. But this cycle transcends this initial embrace of the collective as these egalitarian and collectivist structures solidify. They tend to inadvertently pave the way for novel forms of individualism. And this ironic shift arises when the foundational elements of this mutual trust and collective organization, which is originally conceived to enhance social unity, begins to be perceived as impediments to personal freedoms and autonomy. This leads to individuals echoing this chiefdom and aristocratic tendency of being the forebearers and seeking these avenues to express their distinctiveness from the group and their distinctive personal agency, which is often against the framework of the initial collective intention and collective grouping. And so this resurgence of individualism typically manifests as either a critique or backlash against the prevailing collective norm, and it results in the use of social technologies and infrastructures that seemingly were designed for this to rationalize this community, this communal mechanism is now paradoxically morphed into instruments of control and restriction. So that's quite interesting. This historical narrative seems to now spin in circles, with each collective phase unwittingly setting the stage for a future era of individualism, and then conversely, each era of self expression, laying the groundwork for a return to communal values. And this perpetual cycle seemingly shapes and reshapes society in a never ending dialectical process between a individual's material wants and needs back to the community's grouping together based on the organizing principle of love. And observing this endless cycle is probably, observing this, what seems to be this endless cycle of one and the other, this yin and yang, which seemingly, when you look at it, when you're trying to figure out where does this all come from, what is the meaning to all of this, it's very complicated and it's very frustrating. And historically, frustrating things drive people to drink. And in ancient times, as I said, alcohol, particularly like a proto-beer, proto-wine, served as this means to utilize surplus crops, but also function as a symbol of this communal unity. And this played a significant role in social and ceremonial gatherings, and was integral to these religious rituals, which included those related to worship and the stuff related to the honoring of the dead and giving the dead safe passage. And the use of this alcohol as a social and cultural binder has been, you can see it evolve over time, adapting to various cultural contexts and social practices. So what's really interesting, and this is something that I've talked about many times in the past, about Karl Marx and his struggle with alcoholism, and it's intriguing to me to consider how his experience with this might not have clouded his understanding, but perhaps led him to understate the significance of alcohol's role in capitalism, because alcohol consumption has served as a ritual promoting social connectivity and solidarity. And in Marx's analysis, especially in Das Kapital Volume 1, he touched on how economic structures like capitalism could influence personal habits like drinking to use those for profit. And Marx recognized that a capitalist society would exploit that to a means that would result in decay. And that is what changed the social role of alcohol, because in modern times, the act of drinking is still prevalent, but the genuine social solidarity that it represented is no longer there at all. We drink to feel it, to bring that feeling back, but it does not exist. And people drink to simulate this social connection, which is a response to the alienation of the real social connection that should be there in genuine connection to other humans being void. They try to fill it with alcohol. And this is all just this reciprocating cycle of individualism followed by a return to the collective that is then followed by a return to individualism, and that thing that we reach out for that holds us together when we're in the collective, we try to reach out for as individuals, and it's just no longer there. And through this, we understand how the ritualistic consumption of alcohol, despite how it was known to be harmful, was seen as a remnant of past social structures where people were often very much more interconnected and shared a sense of collective solidarity, where doing an act like drinking a poisonous soluble would be seen as a good thing, right? The tradition of working hard and then drinking, that goes back thousands of years, where it was a part of celebrating the fruits of communal labor and sharing the resulting products like alcohol within that social group, because you did it for a higher cause. And the act of drinking, it is still often done in these ways, but it is completely devoid of any type of communal context. And there's only that sense of alienation that's in its place. And that means that we express ourselves through our individualized self-destruction of the consumption of alcohol. And that leads to a societal that is in decay and is showing self-destruction of social behavior. And that's what we're living in. And so this is how the modern social order has evolved from a state of detachment from our collective past, resulting in this institutionalization of this detachment through capitalism. And so this is because of a mutual care and social trust that was once rooted in a direct connection with the land and communal living with each other, which has been abstracted and incorporated into the capitalist system over a long period of, thousands of years. And in this system, what was once for you you showed care for your family by literally showing care for your family. In capitalism, caring for your family and the community is equated to working, exploiting yourself, earning money, rather than cultivating any type of relationship with the land or fostering mutual support within a community. And this shift has led to a situation where genuine expression of social care and mutual trust are completely alien to us. And that's, we see things like the Red Scare because of it. And this creates so much fear and understanding of even just the basic concept of a community. And people are conditioned to express themselves only through material consumption and participation in the market. And those who resist in this participation in this system are often seen as outsiders, and they feel alienated as if they are the only ones that feel this way, despite it being a common sentiment among most people living in society. And this is the thing, is that we are all together in this alienation, but we're not all together. We're deeply alone. This feeling of isolation exacerbates the conditions of our society. And that's because for any type of true progress, it requires us stepping away from this entrenched collective alienation. And we have to cope with this anxiety rather than succumbing to it. And we have to cope with it in a natural way, not by using alcohol, not by chemical intervention, in a natural way. That would be revolutionary. And by facing these challenges, we would be able to foster better relationships with ourselves and everybody around us, which would create a more connected and supportive community outside of the confines of the capitalist framework. And in a world that's dominated by consumption of material goods, there is this perceived lack of alternative means to express our character, our identity, and our relationships outside of the material capital market. And this leads to a pure sense of alienation, as we're totally disconnected from our true selves and our true personalities, which has been totally co-opted. Our agency has been co-opted by our material interests connected to capitalism, right? And as a result of that, people can only fill the void of that personality that has been stripped from them and replaced by their consumption towards capital. They try to fill that void in their identity by engaging in activities that will allow them for personal expression. That's like the pursuit of academia, philosophy, the pursuit of physical acts, sports, politics. These mediums are the primary ways in our current framework to experience pleasure in the uniqueness that we're able to, rather than through genuine connections with others or by contributing to an actual collective. And this has impacted me. This is me. And that's really the role of politics or these other things in today's society. Because historically, these pursuits have been a pursuit of privilege. They're accessible mainly by those who have either ample free time or minimal work commitments. And as a result, politics has become an expression of identity and pleasure rather than any type of tool for any type of material change. And this creates this system of, this gaming of politics by the most privileged people is traced back to ancient societies, where in Greece, democratic processes were often reserved for the privileged class, such as the aristocracy or the gentry, and elections were only even the electoral college, right? Like it's only the people deemed good enough to vote were allowed to vote. And so this has evolved through time, and we might not see this, but that's what it is. Politics is completely detached from the material, completely detached from anything meaningful, except perhaps maybe at the very local or municipal level. And for many, many, many political engagements, this is just an ideological pursuit, a game, a struggle, and it's carried out predominantly by privileged people. This transformation of politics into a personal expression of identity rather than a means for a collective material change is a symptom of this deep alienation that this entire system creates. It is an identity crisis created and induced by capital-dominated societies. Politics is viewed in our society through the arena, in the framework as sports, and as a substitution for war. Aristotle, again, this is a classic historical thing. Aristocracies forged through warfare have been now forged through the pursuits of sports or entertainment. And these things have the same type of pageantry and mythopoetic nature that shaped the aristocracies of the past. And there's a correlation between the involvement in sports and attaining high-level political positions throughout history, not to mention Donald Trump, who has he's in the WWE Hall of Fame and was a supporter of the UFC from the very beginning. This has influenced their political persona through this lens of the sports framework, because it works completely congruently. And you look at other figures who are like on the periphery of politics, like people like Dana White, who blend their sports identity with a political influence. And we see this with tons of different people, with sports owners lobbying the government. Like it's still there. It's existed for a very long time. And this increased sensationalization of politics, which encourages observers to view it through this framework of sports, creates a tribalistic approach just like sports, which is often just seen as in opposition to whatever the perceived prevailing narrative is, rather than any type of expression of like an individual belief in a better. And again, this sensationalization of politics framed in the sports framework turns these political events into nothing but a spectacle of identity, which just leads to deep tribal and ethnogenetic divisions, schismogenetic divisions in society. And this spectacle of politics serves, and I know this because I've been in it, this spectacle of politics serves to delineate and exhaust all forces that seek to change the status quo. The intersection of politics and spectacle is weaponized to maintain the status quo, which creates this, spectacle of identity that is perpetually in conflict with itself, which is replacing the military combat of old with this diplomatic struggle in the arena of sport. And there is an element of this that is so, like I've talked about this before, like kayfabe. Like we see it where personal defeats or losses are like strategically used to regain power in the future. like a sacrificial lamb or a scapegoat. And this is like one's weakness to highlight an enemy's vulnerabilities. This mentality is derived from generalized combat, from literal hand-to-hand combat or any type of combat, like to, like the Democrats funding the far right in the 2022 midterms to make them easier to beat. Things like that. These are tactics that are derived from combat. And this concept has roots dating all the way back to the Maya ball games, where success in this game was intertwined in politics and social status and determined the player's survival. This historical example illustrates how identity is often tied to forms of nationalism expressed through spectacles like sports. People's identities are shaped by these regional state nationalisms, with sports and physical spectacles serving as a key medium to upholding those. Even today, when politics is the primary focus, it is often played out through the realm of sport, and vice versa. And this is pretty much this spectacle of identity formation basically is not even in reality based in any type of ideological framework. It's theoretical. It lacks any type of material substance. And that's the problem, is that true politics, any type of meaningful expression of a political thought, should be a genuine connection between two people who are really trying to create a better place in the material framework that we're currently living in. Not some adherence to a theoretical ideological framework or attachment to some superficial symbol that you attach your identity to. And our society will continue to struggle with this, as everything has become polarized and politicized, which has turned every aspect of life into this binary struggle between good and evil, devoid of any kind of nuance. And this binary thinking, has diluted our art and expression, self-expression, our entertainment in every way, which traps us in this cycle of us versus them and oppositions to this perceived dominant narrative. And this is detrimental to the complexity of human personality and human expression in our psyche. This will cause a deep conflict in our collective psyche, which we see manifesting at an increasing rate. This escalation of sensationalization in politics parallels with this simplistic good versus evil narrative in media and culture, and echoes these same concerns that were brought up by people like Adorno, people like the Frankfurt School of Critical Theory, the scrutiny of mass culture and media propagating dominant ideologies, which reduce complex social and political issues to just these binary oppositions. And Adorno talked about this trend in media and culture, where stories and narratives are framed in this heroic black and white dichotomy, mirroring a oversimplification seen in the current political discourse. And while this appeals to the very simple-minded because of its clarity and the drama, the narrative that it can present, it obscures any type of nuanced reality of any actual political or social cause, which then leads to nothing but a polarized spectacle of identity. And this phenomenon is an indication of a deeper structural issue that we see in empires that are striving to either take control or keep control, or in this instance, maybe one last grasp at any type of manageable control, where they're trying to use the maintenance of the organizing principles, which are violence and force, to reconsolidate the power structure. And in this context, the sensationalization of politics with this hero and villain narrative that the liberal world order are trying to perceive with like the far right, and the people like Biden is supposed to represent the left. This is not just a distraction, but it is a tool to uphold the power structure through this division and conflict. And Adorno's insights suggest that this is a sign that society is moving more towards this troubling reliance on force and coercion over dialogue and understanding, which is a sign of an empire moving towards this like hinge point, right? Or maybe not a hinge point, a cornerstone moment, because this is the thing, and this is what I've been really focusing on in probably in the last year or so, in the lead up to like coming to the point to be able to explain this. This idea of our empire getting more and more principled towards its organizing factor of violence, getting more and more principled towards the use of force, is actually, as we're seeing this happen, and obviously it's terrible, and obviously it's a horrendous display of outright violence that we're seeing in a mass, in a capacity that we haven't seen in a very long time. It is a sign, though, of these empires putting themselves in a position to become, to be defeated or to dissolve, because this is the point. As empires become more violent, and if your empire's only organizing principle for your empire, for your state, is violence and force, your state will then perpetually remain vulnerable to being captured by a more powerful force. This reliance on violence as a foundational principle is like it's like the call to the void. It's a self-destructive impulse, because there will always be someone more capable of greater violence. History shows this, like the Aztec and the Inca. They had much more violent social structures. That made them vulnerable. They were far more easily conquered compared to societies with adaptive structures like the nomadic or matriarchal societies of the Mohawk or the Plains people. These societies, they were eventually captured, but they had far more flexible and resilient forms of organization and thus resistance, which shows the dangers of relying solely on force and violence for your own state capacity. And historically, state and social structures were maintained through a combination of dominance, force, and violence. But these systems are also held up by elements of social care and mutual trust, and also a labor of love among people. And these softer elements help bind communities together. But in modern times, this labor of love no longer exists, which brings about this profound sense of alienation. People are now compelled to adhere to the constraints of social capital for their own personal advancement, which means they're failing to conform to these societal expectations, and that leads them to further alienation and a lack of self-care for themselves and for others. And this is all happening in the absence of a true mutual trust and care. People will deviate from the social norms and find themselves isolated with no one to assist them. That is why we have mental health issues in this world, because humanity is not wired to be doing what we're doing, but we're forcing people to do it. And when people become oriented to their material conditions rather than their conditions to love, their ability to love, their capacity and organizing principles for love and care and the need for it, that when you switch those things, you will create a haywire society that is deeply, deeply disturbed. So with our organizing principle of society shifting towards violence and force, it fosters a view that of the world that sees it through our material domination. And this is where this comes from, where like if you're not participating in capitalism of the material domination of others, it's perceived as a lack of care or contribution to society. If you're not exploiting yourself or dominating others, you don't care. And this is this prevailing belief that if an individual is not actively involved in the capitalistic pursuit of exploitation, self-exploitation, or domination, they are deemed indifferent to others. And that's the social alienation that comes in capitalism, is baked into it. And this, again, we used to be balanced by a system of care and trust. We are now balanced by a system of force and violence and domination. And so, one moment. Excuse me. Okay. So, when reflecting on this human evolution and the expansion of this, our personal individualization, we see that this process has been integral to defining our humanity and what makes us the species that we are. This individualization leads us to realize more about ourselves, connecting deeply to what makes us human as individuals. This concept of individualization is justified by people asserting that they hold more value as individuals rather than a part of a collective, which then aligns themselves with a cause greater than the basic human need to survive, which represents a departure from the natural evolutionary course. And a key aspect of understanding individualization is our relationship to the fear of death. So we perceive death as a frightening unknown, associated with pain or an unimaginable experience. This fear stems from the idea of the extinction of our physical being. However, there is also a sense of peace in accepting mortality, which is a part of the collective psychology of our humanity. Believing in something greater than oneself will help transcend the fear of death, allowing us to see beyond our singular existence. And so the fear of death often revolves around the fear of pain or the fear of suffering. But when considering what lies beyond that, fear becomes far less tangible. It's either conceptualized as this nothingness or as an unexplained existence beyond our comprehension. For those who believe in hell, the fear of death is mostly tied to an inability to cope with the personal reality and the consequences of your actions, or the fear of missing out on more life. Human development has largely been driven by our engagement with our mortality. That seems very obvious, but it's true. Propelling our individual evolution and survival instincts, this individualism is really the driving factor to our human progress. Our fear of our individual mortality, distinct from our collective existence, makes us this exceptionally adept creature that has survived throughout time in not the best circumstances that we've been given in. But we have this focus on our individual survival skills as being a part of a collective, which is a part of this subconscious cycle that operates collectively based on the need for love, and individually based on the need for food, water, things like that. And so while we may not fully be conscious of this cycle, we witness it and feel it manifest every day in our species. And understanding the division in our collective psyche here, which mirrors the class divide, is crucial because this class divide is perpetuated through coercive means, including the threat or actual use of violence, the manipulation of manipulation, deceptive claims of divinity, or emphatic assertion of being God. In each of these instances, the class divide is driven and maintained by some force of some form of coercion. This really blew my mind. So, the concept of freedom is deeply intertwined with social relationships. Interestingly, the word free is derived from a Germanic root that is also linked to the word friend, which this etymology suggests that the true freedom involves the ability to form friendships and commitments. So in societies where slavery or bondage exists, individuals are deprived of this fundamental aspect of freedom, as their capacity for mutual trust and commitment within the society does not exist. Thus, they can't have a friend because they are not free. This lack of freedom extends beyond the individual level of effect. It affects entire groups, subjecting them to collective bondage, as seen in historical social structures like in serfdom. However, in serfdom, with that collective bondage system, the social aspect of being a social slave inhibits the formation of these genuine friendships. And this is because the lack of social freedom under such systems leads to social alienation. Individuals become alienated not only from each other, but also from themselves as a result of the restriction and limitation imposed by their economic and social circumstances. The collective bondage system that I just mentioned. So I think I actually might have said this incorrectly. The collective bondage system, like serfdom, held that social trust in a way that could actually be manifested and materialized in a way that was practical and was done because humans were still able to express genuine social trust. The social aspect of being a social slave within capitalism truly does inhibit us from forming genuine friendships, because it is this lack of social freedom under capitalism that leads to the self-alienation that leads us to be self-destructive. Individuals become alienated not only from each other, but from themselves. And this is the result of the restrictions and limitation imposed by their economic and social circumstances. This self-alienation is a direct consequence of the bonds forged by capitalism and societal structures that which are further in. This self-alienation is a direct consequence of the bonds forged by capital and societal structures, which further emphasize the complex relationship between freedom, social bonds, and class structure in human society. This separation we've imposed upon ourselves largely stems from our need to rationalize mutual trust. Instead of maintaining this unspoken, intuitive bond, we've chosen to formalize relationships into tangible, trackable forms. This is what led us to the emergence of systems like serfdom, slavery, and bondage, because these systems were first set up to quantify our human experience and which confined it into the material realm that disconnects it from any type of natural living universe. The introduction of writing, names, numbers, this made individuals legible and subject to state control. It was initially meant to, it was stemmed from noble intentions. The idea was to create a society where resources and responsibilities were distributed according to each person's abilities and needs, a concept that aligned with many egalitarian societies. And in many cases, the formation of statehood began with these positive aspirations. But over time, this collective progress often regresses to favor individual individual instances of the higher interest. This collective progress will always lead to these tools and systems designed for the collective good being co-optive to benefit the higher class. This pattern repeats itself over and over again throughout history. Simple acts such as assigning a name would have dual implications. On one hand, being identifiable by the state can ensure access to essential resources like receiving bread during drought. On the other hand, this legibility also means that you're being subjected to state control and obligations like taxes. And historically, it appears that these systems began with the intention of providing for all, but eventually evolved into mechanisms for control and exploitation. The ability to access basic necessities became conditional upon fulfilling state-imposed requirements. And this is this shift that sees us going through this cycle throughout history, depending on where, when, and the material environment in those areas. But this struggle balances us through this collective history, but that balances our collective well-being with now the collective well-being of like the masses, along with the collective well-being of the individualized power structure and the individuals who hold that power structure together. And so this is the great irony. The great irony in the evolution of our social structure lies in the fact that the systems we created to rationalize and institutionalize and materialize our collective social bonds and mutual trust have, in many ways, led directly to our own servitude. These systems were intended to facilitate and manage societal functions, essentially to aid the collective, but the singularity of our individual experience, when translated into these formalized systems like bureaucracy and systematic management, inadvertently transform these supportive mechanisms into tools of enslavement. That's how our brains work. That's how society is then formed. Historical patterns often reveal that efforts to formalize social trust and cohesion lead to exploitation. The dawn of everything shows this, with the emergence of the peasantry, where systems meant to defend the common folk ultimately contributed to their oppression. This trend was also mirrored in the Inca civilization, as seen with the treatment of the Ayllu system, which was originally just this nuanced, flexible social system that was subsumed into a grid bureaucratic structure. The Quipu, which, while seemingly was equitable, reduced individuals to mere numbers and inadvertently created a class of laborers and perpetuated inequality. So now another example is in contemporary society. Capitalism was heralded as a pathway to freedom and prosperity. The paradox is that it contributes to a form of self-enslavement. As the market dynamics prioritize profit and competition, the promise of prosperity becomes directly linked to the subjugation and exploitation of yourself or the domination of others. This system, under the guise of offering individual liberty and economic opportunity, leads to a cycle where success for some necessitates the marginalization and domination of many others. And as we strive to succeed within these parameters, we perpetuate a structure that binds us to perpetuating these cycles of domination and exploitation, which creates a cycle of self-enforcing, this self-enforced loop of dependency and control and further alienation, thus voiding any type of true, genuine social bond. While capitalism proposes capitalism rises all ships, it results in a complex web of economic and social constraints that lead to a collective self-alienation and self-enslavement under the systems that were designed to give us freedom. And so it's this process of rationalizing and subjugating mutual trust and then individualizing that freedom from out of that collective, which has become so entrenched in our society that the original spirit of that trust and mutual support, along with any common individual freedom, has become completely void, or at the very least significantly eroded. But depending on where you are, based on your inherent privilege, it's either totally void or significantly eroded. And as we progress through various social and economic systems, we attempt to formalize this collective trust. These systems turn against us and they become instruments of bondage. This has led to this liberalization of individuals who are often unwillingly becoming a part of the system simply because their material interests depend on it. Even if they don't actively choose to participate, their need to avoid the negative consequences forces them into compliance with the system. And then consequently, there is this sort of gravitational pull towards the center of this system, which draws people in. And it's often, most often than not, completely against their will or original intentions or better judgment. And then this revolution, the evolution of this system reflects this complex interplay between the need for our social organization and then the unintended consequences of the attempts at systemizing this mutual trust. And over time, this process of individualization leads to the creation of the class system, and then the idea of everyone being equal or godlike was always attainable, as there would always be an oppressed class within this framework. And this is where the current political dichotomy comes from. This is exactly where it comes from. The political dichotomy that we live in stems from the individual ways in which we interact with and each other and the societal system in which we're living in. On one side, there's those who benefit from the existing system that seek to preserve it. Their goal is not to spread their way of life to others, but to maintain it for themselves exclusively and for their next of kin. Literally the 14 words. This desire to preserve their lifestyle leads to this resistance against any form of equalization that might threaten their status, which includes the preservations of concepts like the right of kings and the aristocracy. And then, on the other side, we have what is typically associated with the left. And those are the people who, despite being part of the system, also feel exploited by it by witnessing what it's doing to everyone. And this group not only includes just working class people, but also upper class individuals who are aware and see the exploitation and suffering that is intrinsic to the system that they benefit from. And these are people who advocate for dismantling this current system, getting rid of the hierarchy in favor of a more collective approach where social trust and mutual support are the key organizing principles, and they don't need to be formalized or institutionalized. And then in the center is liberalism, which neither seeks to completely preserve nor revolutionize the system. Instead, liberals often aim to gradually reform the system and extending the potential for market participation and exploitation to lower classes, basically. And they view this as a way to lift these classes up, by enabling to participate in the market-driven prosperity system, which still relies on the exploitation of then a lower class. And so this tripartite division reveals deeper perspectives on human value with each ideology. Both conservatives and liberals, though, they have differing approaches, but they might not fully recognize the humanity of those beneath them in the social hierarchy, thus rationalizing this exploitation. That's why there's no left, because the system depends on exploitation, and we can't have anybody representing the point of there should be no exploitation. Liberals in particularly, they extend their capacity for exploitation to traditionally oppressed groups under the guise of empowerment and market participation. They perceive this as progress, even if it entails the creation of a new exploited lower class. This is a tactic. There is a part of this where you are able to see people who are considered lesser than human than you. And this is a fundamental perspective on human value and dignity. And it's what distinguishes these political ideologies and their approaches to the societal structure, right? Conservatives and liberals literally don't see the lower class as the same as them. And they see them as a pawn for either power or a threat. And that's essentially it. The daunting aspect of this is to look at our societal dynamics and see the additional layer of delusion that's deeply ingrained in us, which obscures our ability to recognize the material changes in which that are changing around us. We're wired to consistently undermine any progress that anybody makes. And this goes back to the Marx quote. The tradition of all dead generation weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. So we find a profound understanding of this phenomenon. This quote suggests that the legacies and norms of past generations heavily influence and often constrain our current thought processes and actions. And I mean, that's bang on, Carl. Over the past centuries and more rapidly in more recent decades, we've been conditioned to alienate ourselves and doubt any of our abilities. This self-alienation is paradoxically the driver for our improvement and significantly impacts our efforts for material change and revolutionary action. We exist within a framework of self-doubt and self-undermining, which prevents us from acknowledging and building upon any of the progress that we make because we're unable to see it. And this tendency manifests not just in the political arena, but also in societal movements that indirectly influence political movements. Even when we achieve victories, we often find ourselves undermining the achievements that are made. And instead of acknowledging the effort and progress, we fall into infighting and fail to provide any positive reinforcement for the work that we've done. And then, although this pattern occurs in relatively few instances, when it does, it starkly highlights the self-imposed barriers to recognizing and building up our achievements. When we do actually get success, it's extremely hard for us to see it or appreciate it. And so this cycle of self-sabotage and underestimation of our own accomplishments is a vivid example of what binds us to state servitude. It reflects this deep-seated challenge within our collective psyche where the shadows of our past generations and our ingrained habits of self-doubt and alienation hinder our ability to fully realize and appreciate our potential for change and growth. Again, the Marx quote, people make their own history, but they do not make it under the conditions as they please. Do they not make it under self-selective circumstances, but under the circumstances existing, giving and transmitting from the past? And, there is such a crucial insight there. We're not creating history in a vacuum. We're doing so within the framework that was shaped by the past, and that includes how the framework that shaped the past shapes our brains. This is vital, right? This is vital in understanding our current social, political, institutional, and ideological dynamics, and not just that, but also our personal world. Because if you're able to see, you don't make your own history. You make your own history, but you make it not in the conditions of your choosing. You're able to realize the world that you live in is not the fault of others or your fault or anything, but is the fault of the material conditions in which you've all lived in. So even as we strive for change, our efforts are often colored by this legacy of servitude, bondage, and self-alienation that has ingrained in our collective psyche. This alienation is coupled with a subconscious drive for our own self-destruction, which means that any progress that we make is invariably tainted by our inability to fully escape these deep-seated patterns of being incapable of seeing it. We find ways to undermine our achievements, plagued by self-doubt and a failure to acknowledge the significance of our victories. This cycle of undermining and alienation affects all aspects of our social interactions, the outcomes of all of our collective actions as in politics and just as humanity is in general. The history of socialism is a perfect example of this, marked by a pattern of initial intention, co-option, and then results in the divergence significantly from the original goal. It's almost as if our efforts are in a negotiation with a predetermined outcome, rooted in the very system we're trying to change. The issue at hand is that we often focus on changing the system, not realizing that the system is a reflection of ourselves. To truly understand and affect change, we must first recognize that this is a mirror effect. Even in the process of liberalization, where segments of the population are seemingly uplifted, the underlying mechanisms still serve the state's interests. This is evident in neoliberal policies where economic shifts such as inflation create this illusion of access to wealth while perpetuating this existing global order at the same time. The mobilization of the middle class and the extension of the consumer power are strategies to maintain the status quo, not genuine efforts towards egalitarianism. In this landscape, we grapple with the challenge of realizing meaningful change that transcends the limitation imposed by our historical psychological baggage. The current socioeconomic landscape is witnessing a trend where more individuals that were previously lower income are becoming lifted up to become upper middle class and being lifted into a higher economic bracket. And this phenomenon, which I term liberalization, is occurring within the framework set by the state. It's not aligned in any way with any type of socialist or egalitarian principle, but with neoliberalism. And this is like where they're using inflation inflation plays a crucial role by increasing the access to money to a broader population, but the increase is not uniform across all economic strata, right? Like someone who previously earned $39,000 might now earn $57,000, but this pales in comparison to someone who used to earn $390,000 but now earns $570,000. See, like the growth rate is similar, but the absolute increase in wealth is vastly different, which benefits those who already have money, and it reinforces their control. And so while this shift appears as an empowerment and upward mobility for the lower class, it is essential to recognize that this exploitation still persists globally. And there is resistance to this, but the deep-seated issues in the Western human condition, such as our inherent self-doubt and alienation, hinders our ability to acknowledge and appreciate political and social progress. Our propensity to focus on the imperfections and potential negative outcomes often overshadows the positive changes that do occur. And this pattern pervades our actions, especially those with progressive intent. And as a result, we often fail to achieve any of our objectives. On the rare occasion that we do, our perception is clouded by this same lens of undermining and self-alienation, which prevents us from fully recognizing and valuing our achievements. And this inability to acknowledge progress is not just a shortfall, it's a fundamental aspect of how we interact with and perceive our efforts in changing the world. And I keep repeating this because it's crucial to articulate, as it differentiates from this liberal viewpoint, which might overlook these deeper systemic issues in favor of a more surface level solution, like let's just print more money, let's just increase the access to cash, right? Let's maybe do a universal basic income, because if we do a universal basic income within capitalism, that won't change anything. That will just make consumers better consumers. And so this tendency to overlook progress is partly due to the societal dichotomy that perpetuates this sense of helplessness against the ruling class and the established system. This system is designed by those in power, and it often renders traditional methods of effecting change completely ineffective. And as a result, people engage in struggles within the constraints of the framework that has shaped their identities. This framework not only reflects our purely negative traits, but also reinforces them and creates a cycle where this system becomes more entrenched and resistant to any type of positive change because it's so polarized against each other. And this dynamic is underscored through the complexity of attempting to effect any type of meaningful change within a system that is deeply rooted in the reflective of our own societal and psychological limitations. And because in this landscape of capitalism, there is this gravitational force that seemingly alleviates people through a process of liberalization, this liberalization is still intertwined with social alienation. This process creates a distinct split in our psyche in the upper middle class. Again, left, right, center. The left is demonstrated to be, the left has social solidarity. It can relate to the lower class to some extent. In contrast, liberals primarily view the lower class as a means to an end and treat them as like potential voters or pawns to further their political power. On the far right, there is an even more stark disconnect, as far-right individuals, despite being subjected to the same capitalist system, are aligned themselves with the upper class or the ruling class, and they might not even be able to perceive the lower class as fully human, which reflects that deep-seated divide in our societal perception and relations. And this division really has personal relevance to my life story, particularly in understanding my inherent social status. I think in every sphere where political, radical, protest-based, or within any type of philosophical arena that is for the pursuit of truth, there is a constant pattern of self-undermining, self-alienation, and self-destruction in any type of institutionalized form. And the way that basically manifests from a single person into a group is through trauma and through abuse and through violence and force. And the way that I relate to that is because I was abused as a child at the hands of a caretaker, and it continued for years. And the sexual abuse seemed, it didn't seem it didn't seem odd to me. What seemed odd and the most distressing was the part where other people found out about it and witnessing my reaction to how those people took it when they found out about it. And this alienation led me to growing up with deep resentment towards my social conditions, because I felt like my, upper class, I have, mostly everything that I would want as a young person. I felt like it wasn't deserved because of my failings as like a social being, because of the alienation that I had based on what happened to me and seeing people react as if what happened to me happened to them. And so I distanced myself from my peers, or as I got older, I distanced myself from my peers or like my contemporaries as far as like my parents' friends, kids, and stuff like that, because I really didn't relate to them because I had a resentment towards those type of people, because um, I saw my family entity in my direct peers. So I found solace and friendships with individuals who were I saw as lower in the socioeconomic class structure, and also those dealing with like mental health and drug issues, as I found those people to be more relatable to me. And as I grew up, I began to um, over time, I began to like really not resent my upper middle class background, which I realized is not escapable. I was born into it. It's the same thing as the aristocracy, or it's based on birth. And through by doing this acceptance is also coinciding with my material conditions getting better, career success. And so gradually I found it difficult to maintain resentment towards my class status or relate authentically to those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, because if I did so, I would be an outright hypocrite because I'm not struggling anymore, right? I still share values with these individuals, even though I can't fully comprehend their daily struggles with basic needs like I did at one point. But a significant part of my identity was tied to these struggles. And so reconstructing my identity has been a challenging process since in that struggle. And so I feel like what I'm saying here reflects like this fundamental human need for social security and a sense of self-worth, often driven by materialistic goals like securing a nice apartment or a good job. And as I became more and more successful and less able to relate to those like from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, I began to isolate myself among my contemporaries, which affected my relationships. And this behavior seemed almost like schizophrenic, with no logical reason other than like a subconscious desire for my own self-alienation. And in our society, we often express love. I mean, in our society, we mostly only know how to express love through material means, but genuine love and human connection transcends materialism entirely. And I realized that by choosing love and expressing it beyond material forms. And through that, I would be able to overcome this self-imposed alienation. However, one key element of the condition that I face, along with a number of other people that are much like me, is that the trauma to which that has shaped the way I see the world has been rationalized in my brain to the point where it has created these polar opposites of brainwaves, where because of my inherent class privilege, along with my ingrained social alienation from the abuse of my childhood, I'm not oriented towards my material conditions in the way that others are, because my material conditions, even when they were at my absolute worst, were still better than most people who haven't had the inherent class privilege that I had. So because of that, I don't have this like depressive state that I land in due to depleting material conditions. Because of the learned resentment of my inherent class status, I see the world through the lens of lesser privileged people, to which I am able to contextualize versus the place to which I sit in the class hierarchy, which makes me realize like, hey, it might be bad for you right now, but deep down, it could be so much worse. And that's really what keeps me from landing in that depressive state when I have material constraints. Because when I used to get into that state, when I was poor or my material conditions were less, what did I do? Well, I got into politics. I got into activism. I did things that I felt would better my material conditions. Now, of course, that was a fantasy, and all of the organizations and groups that I was involved with were basically just meant to rinse me of any motivation to try to change things. But then in doing so, I meet people, I become social, and this is where everything changes, because due to the neglect and abuse and trauma that shaped me on a social level, I'm not able to properly express myself, my needs, or my wants in social settings with people I trust, because I've never been able to do that comfortably without it feeling like it would be seen as an attack on others. And because of that, when I'm in social groups and other people are making their demands and needs and wants heard, it makes me alienated, because in seeing others having their needs and wants met, I don't have mine met, simply because I'm incapable of expressing them in a healthy manner. And another thing that happens because of this, like, I'm incapable of expressing to people needs and wants because I'm so used to being okay with what everyone else wants, that, like, when it comes to actually discussing the things in which myself and others around me relate over, when I'm like engaging with people and really starting to build up towards a genuine connection that's going to get me to start seeing the world from a place of love and social trust and mutual care, if that connection is somehow, if it somehow doesn't lead to the place in which I'm hoping it to lead to, if my psychological attempt at synchronizing my brainwaves with these people around me falls short, it will almost immediately put me into this massive depressive state. And because I'm not capable of expressing my emotions properly, I will either just not express that there's something wrong with me and just keep playing along with whatever's happening, or I'll react in a way that's very unproductive and thus will cause more social alienation. And so the way in which this depressive state operates and has operated in my mind since I was a young adult has been this like it's organized in this way and rationalized in my brain, because that alienation that other people that are less fortunate than me have tied to their material conditions, for me, as an inherent middle-class privileged person with neglect and trauma to shape my worldview, that alienation is connected to my social constraints, which while other people might have the urge to like hurt themselves as material beings when they reach this dark place of self-isolation, for me, it's never been about hurting my body. I'm not suicidal. It's always just been about hurting myself as a social being, to which I have partaken in social suicide. This is where you get the conspiracy theorist, the radical, the shit poster. This is all a part of my drive to socially alienate myself and withdraw myself from general society. And it's like all of this pent up emotion, all of this tension, your brain can't hold all of that for that long period of time. So what ends up happening is my brain seems to function in this unique way that cycles between these periods of depression and relief. And it's like my thoughts polarize, creating this back and forth pattern. When I'm focused on the social constraints I face, I feel deeply immersed in like a down type depression based on social anxiety. But then there are times when my attention shifts to the material world and I find some comfort. And during those moments, I feel a connection with others who are also alienated by the effects of capitalism. However, as my material conditions have improved, this sense of connection doesn't feel genuine anymore. And I'm not as constrained by material conditions anymore as I used to be, which ironically makes me more aware of my social alienation. And so this awareness then plunges me back into a state of depression. And it's a reoccurring cycle that I become less materially constrained. My focus intensifies on the social aspects of my alienation, leading to these repeated episodes of depression and temporary relief. And this results in a pattern where my brain, I think, is attempting to categorize and manage this depression, akin to oscillating between two conflicting orientations, much like how someone deals with primal needs such as hunger, thirst, or sleep, which I think is why sleep deprivation actually knocks me out of this brainwave, because my brain starts to be oriented towards those primal material drives to which I'm wired to feel good about. I've always had them, rather than my social drives, which I'm wired to feel bad about. It's as if my brain is trying to time these depressive cycles based on my material and social conditions, preventing them from being ever present, or even worse, in direct conflict. And compared to the complex and cyclical pattern of depression and relief I've described, I think someone with a more neurotypical brain would probably experience depression in a more straightforward and consistent manner without such extreme shifts. And this contrast is significant when I think about the conditions that a bipolar person would have in someone with autism, right? This tendency of my brain to organize obsessively also influences how it processes this depression, and it is a drive that is essentially for balancing my mental process. It helps to redirect my brain waves and shifts them from being analytical about social dynamics to focusing analytically on the material world, while it encourages a more emotional and loving approach towards social interactions, as opposed to applying such emotional interactions to material aspects. This toggles between different modes of thinking and feeling in a continuous subconscious effort in my brain to maintain a harmonious balance in my perception and interaction with the world around me. And I think that this mechanism is pivotal, as it highlights how our brains can develop these subconscious coping mechanisms to navigate our traumas. These adaptive responses to trauma manifest through these polarized brain waves and this separated way of thinking, which becomes a source of ingenuity and practical life skill. And they are instruments in shaping future developments and in our learning from past generational traumas, because it's crucial to do this for our collective evolution and adaptation. These traumas are the keys to better the world. And in addition to providing these subconscious coping mechanisms, our brains also have evolved to proactively ward off more severe mental conditions. And I think this preemptive adaptation is a testament to the brain's remarkable ability to learn and evolve over time and develop mechanisms to mitigate the risk of much more debilitating mental health issues. This process, though, it manifests in ways that are perceived as mental illness. And what might be labeled as a disorder, it could actually be, in fact, the brain's natural way of preventing a much worse disorder. And this understanding highlights our brain's complexity of our evolutionary capacity in safeguarding ourselves from deep mental harm, and recognizing that these manifestations are potential preventative mechanisms leads to a more empathetic and informed approach to mental health. And we can acknowledge that these underlying protective intents of our brain responses are actually healthy and are preventing us from further self-destruction. And I think, considering the brain's evolutionary and adaptive mechanisms, I think we can theorize that the extreme mood swings in bipolar disorder that I'm kind of referring to is like this overclocking of emotional regulation. And I think that this could be the brain's strategy to cope with stress or neurological imbalances, and potentially serves as a neural diversion to prevent the onset of more debilitating symptoms typical of like schizophrenia, because the brain is doing these flips to make it so that your conflicting desires aren't being held at the same time, which would then create like the conflict that would cause like a schizophrenic episode or a neurotic episode. And I think in this context we can see that, purely just a theory, I don't know anything, but I think this makes so much sense to me. I think bipolar disorder to the brain is seen as like a lesser of two evils, whereas the brain is opting to intense mood verifications to stay more grounded in reality, as opposed to the altered reality that schizophrenia creates. And I know this is unconventional, but I think it's a theory that highlights the brain's capacity for neuroplasticity and adaptive functioning over time. And I think it aligns with what we know about the ability of our brains to adapt and protect ourselves in response to various stimuli and trauma. And this is essential because historically, individuals with unique perspectives, like my own, have a tendency for, people who have a tendency for obsessive organization or unconventional thinking, they played significant roles in society historically. But today, these traits are misunderstood and stigmatized instead of being embraced like they should be. My unique thought patterns, which diverge from the normal, not only fuel my desire for new experiences and relationships, they lead to major life changes that other people probably wouldn't decide to do, like moving to new cities. But it also drives my passion for, to do things like this, to write and to stream. I feel like the neurotypical type person wouldn't be driven to do these types of things. And this type of uniqueness of my expression comes from this disorder. But in contemporary society, this divergence is viewed as it's viewed with misunderstanding. It's viewed with direct alienation rather than the reverence that was afforded to eccentrics for their distinct contributions and perspectives that has always helped society. And so this is a pivotal thing for me because it instills a profound sense of liberation, because I recognize the value in eccentrics and what they bring to society. And it makes me feel like, oh, this makes so much sense. It makes so much sense in my role. I understand the importance of authentic self-care and nurturing real life human connections, because I'm able to now see my value in society through the fact that I am eccentric. And even if things are outside of my comfort zone, I'm still willing to do them because it's worth doing. And it will get me to a place where I don't feel those downs, because doing new things is what gives me the up. And I think this approach to life, though, is new to me because I've only recently realized that this is going on, aligns with, my long-held desires. Embrace discomfort. Confront your fear. I've come to see this. It's crucial for personal growth, but also for contributing to meaningful societal change. This is a world that will benefit immensely from the unique insights of eccentrics, and prioritizing one's well-being as an eccentric should not just be a personal choice, but it's it's not just about you to be good to yourself. It's about your value to the community and the greater good of the cause, to be good to yourself, because eccentrics are needed. Whatever you're doing, you see the world differently, you're doing something good. And so the essence of my argument here is that there is a path forward. And it is one that primarily doesn't focus on politics. It doesn't focus on politics as a means for causing material change, but rather on that material change coming by a way of collective growth, personalized for each of our own levels of progress, both as individuals, but also as a whole, progressing towards a new system based solely on the way in which we relate to each other. As individuals, we often fail to see the impact we have on history because we're conditioned to view ourselves as isolated entities outside of history rather than a collective. But so because we're so deeply alienated and disconnected from the collective human experience, we struggle to see ourselves as contributors to a collective history. This perspective aligns with Marx and his notion that we make our own history, but not under the conditions of our choosing. We tend to relate to history as individuals. We see it as a narrative unfolding outside of ourselves. Despite it being a collective expression of our humanity, we have an unlimited understanding of this collective expression, which can reinforce the idea that individuals alone will not significantly influence history. And if they ever did, it was a predetermined historical event. These are instances. There are instances where individuals or groups acting autonomously or not necessarily in coordination with each other brought about positive historical change. These moments, though sporadic, can have lasting impact. The issue is that any improvement within our current system is constrained by our own limitations to see them, and we will continue to see the flaws of our previous systems reflected in our actions until we choose to change ourselves. Improving the discourse of politics and our social culture is one thing, but the real change will happen when we collectively decide to better ourselves, to heal from the damage inflicted by colonialism and capitalism. Everything we do is influenced by these systems and our psyche. That we are deeply affected by them at all living moments, and we replicate the domination, violence, and force of the system in which we live in everything that we do, unless we are making a deep constrained effort not to do it. And most of us aren't able to do that because we don't know what love is. We don't genuinely know what it is to care. And the metaphor that I like to use is a cage. To escape the cage, we got to stop focusing solely on its physical barriers and instead recognize and connect with those around us to lift up the cage. This involves shifting, again, from an individualized perspective to a collective one, understanding that the societal change will occur when numerous individuals make the shift to change themselves, not just for themselves, but for everybody else around them. Every time we choose to reconnect with the collective, society itself shifts. We cannot sustain this dominant system if people are collectively rejecting the desire to hold force and violence over others. Choosing love and rejecting exploitation is the path forward. Love, in this context, the love of others, the love for community, and the love for oneself for your community is genuinely revolutionary. It's not just the feeling, it's a powerful force for societal transformation. All right, that was good.